Welcome to the Education Investment Podcast. In a world where investors are looking for stable and growing long-term returns with social impact, the education sector is becoming increasingly attractive. We speak to leading educators, operators, and investors in the education sector around the world to explore this growing investment theme alongside our listeners. From preschools to K-12 schools to higher education and vocational education. From edtech to education infrastructure. From VC investors to private equity and family offices, we explore it all. I'm your host, Monde Nkosi. Education has always been a big part of my life because my mother founded a school which was across the road from our home. I have benefited from excellent schools and teachers in South Africa and the US. I went on to study education and am now very grateful to be an investor in this sector that I love.
All opinions expressed by podcast guests are solely their own opinions. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.
Today, I am privileged to host Chinezi Chijioke for a conversation on affordable independent schools. We'll discuss his experience building a network of independent schools in Africa and understand why schools have proven to be an attractive sector for investment by institutional investors. And finally, we'll also understand their social impact. Chinezi is the co-founder and CEO of Nova Pioneer, a network of independent schools in Africa serving more than 6,000 students and which has trained more than 2,000 teachers and educators. Chinezi was educated at two of the world's best universities, Harvard and Stanford. He started his career as a maths teacher and was nominated to the who's who of American teachers. He subsequently led McKinsey and Company's African education practice before founding Nova Pioneer with Damani Gibbs. Chinezi is also someone who's had an impact on my life. We met when I was a young university student, looking for ways to get involved in education. Chinezi helped show me that there's many ways to be involved in the education sector, including investing in it. And he's also one of the reasons that I did the MA in Education program at Stanford, a program which he also studied. Chinezi, it's wonderful to have you. Welcome to the pod.
It's good to be on, Monday. You aged both of us with that introduction.
That's great. Look, first off, we'd love to just learn a bit more about you before we get to Nova Pioneer and a bit about your journey. Where were you raised? What was your ultimate journey into the education path?
Yeah, I'm Nigerian American. I was born in Nigeria. And I've essentially spent most of my life living between Nigeria, the US, South Africa, and a little bit in Kenya. That's sort of, I guess, 4 pins on the map. But really, my sort of got excited about education when I first moved from Nigeria to the US. And I think that's really where my heart got committed to education. And it's really just been a journey of how and what in education since. And that was when I was 13. So my earliest sort of dreams and reveries of doing work in education on the continent came when I was 13, when I moved from Nigeria to the US.
That's fascinating. I'd love to learn a bit more on the family side. So what moved your family to the US and what were the reasons?
Yeah, so my dad was a professor. My mom was a librarian. I think we'd spent the first half of our childhood, myself and my brothers, in Nigeria in a wonderful college town, university town in Nigeria called Nsukka. This is I wish that childhood could be replicated. You got to be outdoors all day. You got to run free in the town without worry about safety. Come home when it's late. Do all the things that young kids should do when they're kiddos. But we moved principally for education, for the next chapter of our learning, I think was the main part, and also to get to have an experience of learning about my mom's side of the family, getting to know that part of the family. But it was principally to start as we sort of got ready for high school and the next chapter. I think my parents wanted us to have the opportunities of the schools that we would encounter in the U.S. So that was really what drove the move. I think it also shaped, I mentioned sort of quite early thereafter, realizing that the schools in the U.S. that I was encountering were wonderfully resourced in the set of opportunities it created for young people. And that if my peers from home in Nsukka had the opportunity of those schools, we would take such tremendous advantage of it. I think I just knew that we would maximize the opportunity. I had such a sense of my peers with whom I grew up, and And I think that's where my dream started. I really just got excited about the possibility of what schools could mean for my peers back home in Nsukka and across the continent. And really it was that was the sort of the thing that turned me on to doing work in the sector.
That's fascinating. A professor and a librarian as parents. You had no choice but to be in the sector. And it sounds like, yeah?
No, it's funny. I just learned that my mom used to be the university librarian at USIU in Nairobi at one point while we lived there when I was very young. And it turns out now as Nova Pioneer, we have partnered with USIU in a number of programs, including some of our innovation leadership programs. And so it's really, I was just sending notes out to a couple of my colleagues in Nairobi saying, small world, but I just learned that my mom used to be a librarian there. So yeah, so we were destined one way or another to be wrapped up in ed for most of our lives.
That's fantastic. You've come around full circle. So talk us through then a bit more about your high school journey and university journey. As I mentioned up front, you studied at some of the best universities in the world and had a wide range of options, and it's teaching that you chose to go into.
Yeah, I was, as you said, I'm really fortunate to be able to have the opportunity to be part of institutions and be around the kind of peers that those institutions enable you to be around. So I went to high school in the U.S. It was a boarding school, a Quaker boarding school. The many things I love, and perhaps it's an institution about which I feel the greatest affinity outside of Nova Pioneer, and I think the reason was that it had incredibly positive culture. I think boarding schools can be fantastic or they can be tough, and this was a boarding school where the culture made it fantastic, and it's inculcated a desire to do good in the world, and so I really value that school for the culture that it had and it has. And so I think that's one thing I learned there was the importance of culture in schools and shaping the young people in the community. So that was high school and I loved it. It's called George School. It's in Pennsylvania. And then I went on to Harvard for college where I studied psychology and African studies. And what was most remarkable to me about Harvard were the caliber of peers and friends with whom you get to work every day and learn every day and just be inspired by peers who have each written really interesting stories of their lives at that point, and they're only 18 and 20. You're kind of it's just really inspiring every day. So I really enjoyed Harvard for that reason in particular. And then Stanford. Stanford was after I was a teacher. I went to teach for a while. So I went and I'd actually done an entrepreneurial stint before teaching, but went on to teach. And Stanford and business school was a step of saying I want to go from being a teacher to now leading institutions. And that's why I want business school. I want a bit of preparation, a bit of confidence in being able to move into leading and starting institutions. And what I love many things about Stanford, but I think what I love most about Stanford is the whole Bay Area, and Stanford in particular, you'll share this experience, is a place where it's not unusual to ask, why not? Like, go try something new. There isn't an expectation that you just go walk the path. There's a huge entrepreneurial spirit to it. It's like, go build it, right? It's almost unusual not to be entrepreneurial at Stanford. And I think I love the zeitgeist of a place that was so encouraging of big and bold ideas.
Probably the thing I found most fascinating about there was the approach to failure, where it's fairly encouraged, actually. You've got to go out, try something new, and when you try something new, there's quite a high chance of failure. Here, where I'm sitting right now in South Africa, I think there's probably the opposite culture. There's really, really high barriers to or consequences of failure, and it's not looked at in a positive light. So I think that, there's certainly things we can learn from that part of the world.
And I guess if you want to inculcate innovation and entrepreneurship, you have to encourage trial, lots of trial. And I remember that about Stanford, even the grading schemes and the course selection just sort of incentivized experimentation as opposed to, tough guardrails on achievements.
Absolutely. All right. Look, my last question as we think about your journey and your motivation is just about your time in the classroom. What is your experience like as a teacher?
Ultimately, I think, teaching was like my early years of teaching was another phase of learning. I have never worked as hard as I did in my first year of teaching, and I still haven't worked as hard ever. Through entrepreneurship, through McKinsey, my first year of teaching, I was teaching mathematics. I'd done one math course at a college, so really I was two math courses at college, and really I would be studying. I essentially taught myself Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and figured out and planned my lesson plans and taught the students Monday through Friday again, and so it was constantly learning to teach. And then on top of learning what you're teaching, it's actually learning to teach. And I think part of what informs our practice now, Nova Pioneer, is really supporting teachers and learning to teach. And I in some ways, I wish I had more support as an earlier teacher, and I got to value that. It's created for me an appreciation of not only how hard and how much teachers have to give to build their practice early, but how valuable early supports in teaching practice can be in serving both teachers and students. And so, yeah, it was, loved it, super hard. I almost stayed in it because I really loved being a meaningful part of my students' lives. That's perhaps the biggest blessing of being a teacher, is that you get to be a meaningful part of individual students' lives, and they will remember you if you do a good job of it, if you really care. So I think I considered staying in that role because I really loved it. I got a lot of meaning from it. But ultimately, my dreams were about building institutions at home on this continent. And so stepped away from there to go to Stanford.
Wonderful. Thanks, Chinezi. It's an apprenticeship, and I think it's one of the most underrated things actually out there. People I don't think acknowledge just how hard it is to be a teacher, and especially in your early years. So that's a wonderful anecdote. Let's move on then to some of the core subject matter of this conversation, which is affordable independent schools. So when I speak to people and I mention the word, either the phrase private school or independent school, either one, people immediately think of these extremely elite institutions. They think of, I jotted down a few names here in South Africa, Bishops or Hilton, in Kenya, St. Mary's, or in the UK, Eton or Harrow, or in the US, Harvard, Westlake. I could go on and on. Every country has them. And that's immediately what people's minds go to. But when we've spoken about independent schools in the past, you've been speaking about something far more diverse and far more accessible. So maybe just start by giving us the lay of the land. What is the range of independent schools in the countries where you as Nova Pioneer operate, and where does Nova Pioneer fit in?
Totally. And I appreciate that pivot even in your terminology and inclusiveness from private to independence, because they kind of refer to the same thing. But private often creates that sense of exclusivity, stay away, it's enclosed. Independent just really refers to the fact that the responsibility for schools is not a public responsibility for these schools, and that independent, it gives more independence in setting a vision and intention and approach to how you learn. So it creates an independence. So I think, I often prefer the reference to independence, but private just means they're privately operated, not that they have to be sort of exclusive. And it's a tremendously varied and diverse sector, right? So it's diverse in its formats. You've got nonprofits and for-profits. You've got various listed and unlisted for-profits. It's diverse in who they serve. We've got super low fee, bottom of the pyramid school groups like your famous sort of Bridge International Rising Academies across the continent, to some of the highly expensive and financially exclusive school groups, such as the ones you've mentioned, and a whole range in between. And I'll get back to that because that's one of the key dimensions for sort of mapping out the sector and where we serve in it. And then it's diverse in curriculum. So you've got a national curriculum in South Africa. You've got various international curricula, and they have to be accredited in some regards, but the range of curricula you can use, and then different models or approaches to the ultimate mission of developing success for young people. So, and so there's a huge diversity. But then sort of in the diversity of who's served, I think there's a huge diversity of who's served. So you've got, in parts of the continent, countries where 70% of all income groups are served by independent schools, not just the wealthy. Neighborhood, mom and pop. The vast majority of independent schools across the continent are your neighborhood mom and pop schools, serving low and middle income families. And so, when we think about dimensionalizing it in terms of fees and affordability, because it often drives access, we sort of think of, for a global audience, using currency, you would say sort of what we terminalize as single dollar, double dollar, triple dollar, $4, like you would if you had like a restaurant app, right? Or in, Rand, ZAR, and Kenya shilling. And, the single currency would be like the bottom of the pyramid, super low fee, accessible, has a very broad base of families who like to subscribe to it. And then then you got sort of a lower mid fee. Then across the mid fee, you've got a huge range. You've got sort of lower mid, squarely mid, upper mid. Then you start to get premium fee schools, which are starting to be more exclusive, sort of LSM 10, LSM 9, LSM 10, and then very high fee of the kind of schools you mentioned, which are really financially prohibitive for very many families unless you have some aid or some company sponsorship. And those often are either the super expensive ones that the sector builds its name on, or or builds its reputation often that you refer to, or international sort of tend to serve an international sort of expat audience that maybe has a corporate funder for their school fees. Where we sit as Nova Pioneers, we consider a mid-fee schools. So our families are hugely diverse, both in income and in race diversity and in psychographic diversity. This is a huge diversity. So we'll have it's absolutely first-time first children of the vast majority of our families are working hard monthly to afford fees for their children. And we'll expect the children then to figure out their way into university and to find funding for university. That's, particularly in the South African context, that's the majority of families. But we'll have families that stretch because of what the quality and the nature of what we offer, because it's not just about price. It's actually heavily about what's the educational program you're offering. We'll have families that can afford significantly higher fee points, but choose Nova Pioneer because of what we offer. And so I find there's a huge diversity across multiple dimensions of families. But we would, from a fee perspective, we would define ourselves as mid to upper mid fee in the markets that we serve, which are South Africa and Kenya currently.
In South Africa and Kenya. Okay, that's really helpful context. And maybe just as you think about within the South African and Kenyan markets, you've spoken a little bit about the families that you serve. I'd like to double click on that a little bit, and if there is a specific student or family situation you can think of that comes to mind, please do share. But who do you serve? Give us the profile a little bit of it.
We have families who we serve. Everything from children of gardeners who are really finding a way to find support to be able to attend school, to children of judges who could put down fees on day one, on a credit card, right? So there's a huge range. And I think part of the power of the experience is the diversity of the community. I think all children benefit from that. But that aside, I think in the main, our families are families who are working hard to make a great education affordable for their kiddos. So it's not just a buy expense. It's a priority. Families are prioritizing this and making other choices, sacrifice. So they're working families, whoever can in the family is working, or a small business owner, and sort of using what they've earned to support. And generally we'll expect children to be responsible for the university. A good example I think of, I won't use these students' real names, but I think of Sizwe. Sizwe is not his real name, but he's one of our first graduates. Sizwe's dad worked, he's actually a fantastic example. His dad worked in insurance, was insurance sales. His mom ran a home bakery, sort of a small entrepreneur home bakery. I believe one or both his parents may have studied some tertiary education, but he ultimately, they supported him through high school, right? And they paid his fees, but college is up to him. So he went off to college, he went off to Wits, studied law. He's worked multiple jobs to fund his education. He started multiple businesses while at Wits. In fact, he started a business in which we were one of his clients as Nova Pioneer. So he got in touch and said, I've got a proposition. I'll provide services to Nova Pioneer, and they were strong enough. He was one of our suppliers, and so he funded himself through school that way. Obviously pursued scholarships. He wasn't able. I think he may have qualified for NSFAS. I'm not entirely sure about that. And ultimately, he's now has gotten himself worked his way through law school and has gotten himself an articling position with one of the Big Four. I mentioned, he's an incredibly special young man, but his circumstance is representative of our students. In Kenya, I think of, it's very similar, I think of this young man, I'll call him Peter, for lack of a better word. Actually, the first Novanier we hired back as a staff member, required some scholarship support. And we do have some programs that provide need-based financial aid for some of our students. And so he required some scholarship support, went off to university, earned his way in part through university, so also worked his way through university, earned his degree in architecture, and we eventually hired him in our alumni department, and he's kind of getting more work with our property department now because architecture is his passion, and he's an incredibly talented young person. But I think it's hard to say they're representative because there are so many different stories and backgrounds from which our students arrive. But I think the intention of having they're generally supported through hard work through high school. Ultimately have to find their way to university. And so we support the pathways to university, and they either find scholarships or find work or need to find that tertiary pathway. They're going to be, many of our students at graduates going to be on their own for figuring that out. And so we have to think about setting them up for success there. But also incredibly hungry and dynamic young people whose aspirations, I think a school like Nova Pioneer is really able to create a real platform for success.
It's wonderful, Chinezi. It makes me really happy to hear. I myself was a scholarship recipient at independent schools. I think you're aware of this, and at tertiary level as well. And I've been a huge beneficiary of the independent school system and the wonderful outcomes that come from it. So it's really, really wonderful to hear. And this is an education investment podcast, as you know. So I have to ask you on the investment side of this. Most people don't think of schools as an investment sector. I think that's still fair to say in 2025. But here you are. You've attracted institutional capital, private equity capital, to help fund your growth as a group. So from your perspective, what's attractive about schools as an investment sector? Yeah.
So I think schools have actually a range of propositions for investors. They're ultimately, if you think about it in the total and all of it, they're sort of annuities once they're successful schools. And maybe stepping back even further, fundamentally, they're one of the most evergreen investment opportunities on the continent, particularly education in Africa. Now, if you think about Africa's fundamentals around ed, the youngest continent, half the world's young people pretty soon, the fastest growing population. In fact, one of the only regions in the world that is outpacing, is growing in that sense. And so youngest and fastest, urbanizing, families that invest a significant chunk of at all income levels, invest a significant chunk of their household income in ed. I remember when I was at McKinsey, one of the studies we did was a consumer survey study, and it wasn't intended to be an education study. It was a consumer habit study. Reviewing that data, when I looked at it from an education spend perspective, 24% of household wallet across 16 metropolitan cities across the continent, at all income levels, families are investing about a quarter of their household purse in education expenses, school fees, transport, uniform. African families prioritize education and will invest in it if they see it as an opportunity to create better opportunity for their children. So families are willing to invest, a young population, a growing population at all sectors, and an urbanizing population, and a population that is increasingly switched on to the opportunities that education should plug into for the children, the opportunities that education can be better or different, that you don't just have to accept what education has always been. And so I think that creates the fundamentals of ed are fantastic on the continent from an investment perspective. And really the question is, do you have a model and a team that can deliver on that with value? Right? Like, can you offer a value proposition educationally that is compelling and supports success for young people? And can you do it at a price point that essentially represents a move up for any of the segments you're serving, right? That creates better opportunity for any of the segments you're serving. So from an investor perspective, the real key question there, you've got this sector that has fantastic fundamentals. It can be an annuity. And really the only questions are, do we have the right team and value proposition, the right platform? This is the right platform. What's the right, you may pick price point or proposition a little bit to say, like, what do we believe we want to back, and what phase is it? I'm going to list up a whole bunch of P's in this, platform, proposition, phase, but also like what part of it. So is it, on the property side, and we really want like a risk adjusted, a more sort of, secured annuity? Is it more on the equity investment holdco side, where we can see examples of significant successful listed ed companies that often outperform markets, where there's examples to show that they and have had multiple tiers of take on an investment from sort of angel through growth investor, through listed investor, or a permanent family office kind of holdings. There are multiple examples locally and globally for investors in equity on the equity side. And then there's a sort of what part of the journey, maybe that's the last P in this, is like, is it, are you early stage? Are you sort of, growth phase? You want to establish platform, but you want to kind of take it through the growth, the curve, or are you sort of later stage and you want to sort of more, support continuous growth and continuous, opportunity, leverage on existing platform. I think there's, if you say education broadly, like fundamentally, it has tremendous fundamentals for an investment perspective. And, the key question really is, but there are a limited number of operators maybe who check the box on proposition, platform, performance, team. And then you have to sort of dimensionalize where it depends on the investor. So happy to double click on any of those, or happy to talk about our journey of sort of how we mature through it. But I think, there are many parts around this in which an investor could think about investing.
Absolutely, there's so much there, and I identify with your point on the how much we spend as African families on education and just how important it is to us. So, my wife Nyaki, when we're discussing our non-negotiables in the marriage, in that marriage counselling you do before you get married, one of hers was what schools her children will attend. So there it is.
So you guys had that agreed even before you. Well done.
100%.
But I say it translates into what into the operations. Now, one of the great privileges of being an educator on this continent, I think, is when you step into a classroom, it's not just the families, but the kiddos. I have found more often than not, kiddos are really committed and interested in taking advantage of the education to power their possibility, power their vision, power their aspiration for themselves. So you have kids who are in classrooms who are serious about learning. We shouldn't take that for granted. I've been in, certainly the school in which I taught in the U.S., I found that to be the case most of the time. But there are many schools across the world where kids are just kind of checking the box in classroom. Unfortunately, it's sort of the context. But I find African families invest, and African students are often very take advantage. It kind of gets back to that first point around being excited about what my peers from Nigeria could do with great schools because of how hungry we were for the opportunities that good education could bring us.
Absolutely. That's great, Chinezi. And I want to double click a bit on that investment side. You mentioned the word annuity quite a few times when referring to schools. Just in layman's terms, when I think of an annuity, I think of a steady cash flow stream over a very long period of time. Is that simply what you meant, or is there something more than that? And why do you call education or schools that?
Yeah, and it really gets down to at what point in the journey you want to invest, right? So if you're investing late stage ed and you're investing into a established, sustainable, profit-generating school, at that point, you're essentially supporting its continuous operations, perhaps some growth in capacity, but at that point, it should have as long as you're operating and you have a management team that's able to adapt to the modest changes, there'll be some ups and downs, but generally speaking, it's a pretty steady income stream at that point. But at that point, the school often has less need for equity capital and maybe looking at optimizing its property costs or optimizing its debt. And so it's less upside, but it's a more steady stream. And ultimately, that's the bulk of a school's life after, say, its first, anywhere from 3 to 7th year, depending on when it turns profitable. So once it turns profitable, you've kind of got that stream, and it's more about the opportunities to optimize the learning, to optimize the capacity, and so on in a school. If you start early, it's not just an annuity. I think there's a growth investment aspect, which is if we can back the right platform, an operator who has demonstrated capacity in succeeding in starting schools, for example, that's where the greatest value add happens, but it's also the greatest risk, to be fair, because you're picking a location, you're starting a school, you're building it up, it goes through a J curve, which could be anything from a couple of years to 7 years, depending on the model and the school. And so if that's the case, then you're taking more risk, but there is significantly more upside, and there an equity investor who can, the ideal investor in that phase is someone who can be a longer term investor, who can be a 7 to 10 year plus open-ended type of investor and wants to be on the journey, but has that's what I call like visionary capital. It has the patience it understands the vision, and it can back the jockey, can back the platform, and can see that. And that doesn't necessarily angel. There are angels who start early, but that's an important part. And I think there's actually more opportunity there because there are lots of folks who want to sort of invest late in a profitable enterprise. There are less folks who are willing to see the platform and take it through that sort of transition to self-sustainability and profitability. And so it can have both characteristics. Or if you're on the property side, some schools have a model where their property is separate from their operations. And in that case, you actually have a property investor who has a real asset underpin, right? Or a property lender and look at, and the key there to be, I think, competitive as an investor and sustainable is can I develop a proposition that allows for the rental costs for the school to be sustainable? So it's kind of a win-win, because if you're trying to take all the value out of rental, you ultimately have a school that's just working for its property owner, and that's not a win-win. That's not going to be sustainable. You will get into a rental renegotiation at some point, probably, because it's not as sustainable for the operators either. And so if you have a proposition on the property side that sort of is realistic in its returns, but is underpinned by a good operator, there's also a strong investor. In fact, I think because folks see it as a specialized property asset, it's perhaps underinvested in some ways as an asset class. I think there's real opportunity for sort of more specialized funds that think about ed property investments.
That's really fascinating, Chinezi, on both sides, on the let's call it the school operating side, what you do, and then also on the property side. I think of it in when I think of other industries and people talk about investments and recurring revenue. Right? You would have heard that term all the time. When companies have 3-year contracts, 5-year contracts, that's loved by investors. You know, think of a software company or something along those lines. In this case, for most of your school-going children, it's at least 12 grades. I don't know if you go any further into pre-K, but that 12-year journey, and if you're providing a good educational experience for both the students and the parents, my expectation is they wouldn't really leave. So you've got 12-year visibility, which I actually can't really think of any other industry where you've got that kind of long-term visibility.
Yeah, and that's intention across most families. I mean, I think, your point is right. Like, you've got a multi-year, long-term commitment, and in fact, families want to know they've got a pathway all the way through school and beyond. I think you'll find, families move. You'll have churn in every business. You'll have churn as well in schools. And part of what schools try to do is minimize that churn because it's good for students to have continuity, and it's good for the school to have stability in its student body and in its enrollments. And so, you'll see churn, and you'll see churn differently in economic times. We see it differently by country and by economic cycle. But overall, you've got folks who sign up, and when they sign up for you, they want to be there for a while. And I think that's part of the. There are many things that are hard about ed, but that from a business model perspective, that's one of the things that's really clear. And the other thing that's really great about ed as a business model is each year you can your revenue almost from day one, right? So because you've got your enrollment intake. You might have 1 or 2 intakes depending on how you structure your school calendar, but you effectively know your revenue within a 3% band for the year. And then you can manage your costs accordingly. So it's much more predictable. Predictable, I say carefully because, say predictable in this world and everything changes, but, it's much more predictable, relatively speaking, than industries where you're sort of month to month trying to figure out or season to season or even week to week going through cycles. Schools have a sense of stability that I think is attractive.
The high school I went to is over 100 years old. The high school my daughter was at is over 100 years old. Amazing. And they're at similar locations to where they were back then. And some of the places you've lived in around the world, you're talking 200, 300, 400 years old. So again, the world is never entirely certain, but this has got to be, if you look at industries around the world, this has got to be right up there in terms of stability over a very long period of time.
We saw that in COVID. We saw it was one of the more resilient sectors in COVID,
Yeah. Absolutely. So so you've spoken about on the operator side, that long-term view. You also mentioned that there's almost an entirely separate sector which is linked to these education operators, but which is the property investment side of it, and that feeds right off. You've got this extremely long-term visibility on the school operators, and that then must carry over into the property side, where again you've got this tenant that's going to be there for a very, very long time.
It was perhaps one of our learnings that, we came in sort of with an educator's mindset and which was, we just want to teach and build really effective teaching and learning and culture and great outcomes. And we, had a very clear vision for exactly what teaching and learning would look like and how to develop teachers and how to retain teachers and grow teachers. But I think we underappreciated perhaps how much of the income statement and balance sheet and the capital requirement is in property. Your property costs and your property strategy can sink or rise, can grow or kill a school, irrespective of how good academically or educationally it is. And so for us, I think when I think about property from an operator standpoint, it's about optimizing the costs ultimately of property ownership and being able to be competitive, therefore, in your fees that you offer families. So ultimately, for anyone who is investing in or operating schools, really thinking through your property strategy and your cost of property is hugely important. It's if you think about a rental basis, there are really 2 big costs: property and staff. Those are the 2 big costs in operating a school, and everything else is 20% of your cost base.
Yeah, 100%. You have to get those two right.
Yeah.
And the academics are at the heart of it, and property can kill you if you're not careful. We spoke about these various tiers of schools, and we've spoken about the investment model as well. What do you do differently that enables you to have a lower price point than some of these schools we were talking about earlier at the equivalent of almost $20,000 a year? Some of those schools, you're at a materially lower price point, and yet you've still got a commercially viable model where you've attracted institutional investment, etc. So what do you do in your model that makes all of this work, and also still having the good academic outcomes?
Yeah. And somebody will come back to sort of maybe some of the answer that is really like also like what is our operating model and so on. But to answer that, maybe I'll throw out 3 more P's.
You spent too long at McKinsey, man.
It's really, it's really you look at income statement. It's your property, your people, and then the last P, I would say, sort of platform. So for us, first people. It's people and culture are the source of great learning and ed, and great culture and great community. And so you want to be great at schools, you better be great at developing and supporting the people side of it. And I mean that both for students and teachers. So from a teacher perspective, I think having we sort of construct ourselves an educator engine that develops talents and tries to grow folks and create a culture in which folks want to stay and grow. I think that makes them both more sustainable and ability to replicate and more cost effective. Than you're not constantly trying to go out there and sort of poach talent. You're actually developing talent. And I think there's both a consistency and quality benefit to that. There's a culture and a happiness benefit to it. And there's also like an efficiency benefit to that. Right.
Help me understand that. So is that like a separate teacher training institute within Nova Pioneer, or how exactly is that structured?
No, I mean, our core operating model, we are an educator engine in the sense that our teachers and our educators are hired into and develop within a career ladder it's an apprenticeship. From apprentice to resident to senior resident to dean to school leader, if you want, or to lead teacher. The job of a dean is not, to run the school and then on the side run some professional development sessions. The job of a dean is to coach and develop teachers and develop practice. And a teacher will mentor an apprentice teacher. The job of a school leader is firstly to manage instruction and culture in the school. We have a competency framework and a practice framework around which progression is based on mastery, not based on tenure. That's another core aspect, because if you just have tenure-based progression, every year is a notch based on tenure, you may not, your alignment to quality and cost base is not the same. So you may not have your most impactful instructional leaders being your greatest investments, staff cost-wise, right? Whereas you actually want that. You want to align your investments to the things that deliver quality, lead culture in the school. And so effectively structuring the way we work and the roles we have and accountabilities and how we do performance evaluation, how we do advancement and remuneration, aligning that to mastery and supporting mastery, the whole bunch of where we work every day in the classroom, observations, coaching, PDs, mastery programs, cohort-based programs. We're very much an engine for developing educators. And I think that drives quality and has an efficiency benefit, because also as a teacher, you want both fair competitive compensation and a place you want to work and learn and grow in your professional practice. And that has value. And you can hopefully optimize that as a network. So that's one.
You mentioned the O word, Chinezi, so I have to stop you.
The O word, what's the O word?
Classroom observation.
Yeah.
I've seen both sides of this. I've seen some schools try it, and I mean, for broadly for the audience, this is where a third party is in the classroom and observing the class, and then you can give tips afterwards and advice, and you can assess various things. So I've seen both sides of this. I've seen some teachers feel extraordinarily stifled by someone being in the classroom. I've also seen the other side of it culturally, where it's seen as a positive. People want feedback. Everyone, I think, inherently wants to improve in their job, and as a teacher, it can often be quite lonely, and you don't have someone. So, how have you seen that play out, and how have you tried to inculcate the latter culture?
That's the insight right there. It's culture. You cannot sustain that practice unless there's a culture of what we call always growing and joy of learning. You cannot. You can institute a practice. We're going to observe and provide feedback, but that will not sustain beyond the pressure you put on it if there's not a culture that invites it and welcomes it. And so, yeah, we will, you can come across fantastic, wonderful educators, teachers in a classroom, but if that culture, if they don't want that culture, they're not going to be effective teachers in Nova Pioneer. That's not going to work. So I can, from early days when I used to do some of the teacher interviews in our first early years, I could tell you some hilariously funny stories. Funny is probably the right adjective I'll use here, but of like fantastic hotshot teachers seemingly on paper. Maybe they were effective in the classroom, but there's no way they'd work in Nova Pioneer, because even in an interview process, they did not want to receive feedback. Think about us when we hire a school leader, for example. School leaders will be in a final interview. Your final interview day, you're there with a cohort of other finalists. So the folks for whom you're competing for the job, and you're there in a group day, and you're giving feedback to each other, receiving feedback, and working with each other. Now, I think a lot of our candidates find that completely foreign, but many of them love it. And the fact that they love it is a good sign to them and to us that this is a potentially good fit. And if you're in there saying, whoa, this is unfair. I don't want to be around, like, this is exposing me. Well, it's probably not a good fit. So absolutely, we have to have a culture that invites and sustains that. And I think I've seen some schools where they ratchet up, where literally you've got someone who's observing, who's giving teachers real live feedback, literally into a headset, while they're leading instruction, roaming the room, saying, have you seen the student to your left? Have you checked in? Or you're doing a lot of talking. Are you asking questions or listening? I haven't seen that happen at Nova Pioneer, and I'd love to see that happen at Nova Pioneer. Could just experiment with it. Real life active coaching. But the underlying principle is an invitation that this is what we do. And I think it's fantastic for students too. It role models that we're a learning community, that our teachers are learning too, and they're growing. Students embrace it. It becomes very comfortable. You can, just to sort of wrap this up, you can tell the difference when you walk into a classroom and the teachers and students are comfortable with the fact that you, as someone new, has walked into a classroom to observe what's going on. And it's not a big deal. Or you can walk in and say, all of a sudden everything gets hushed. Folks, maybe the teacher actually asks you, sorry, sir, can I help you? You can feel it. Does it happen normally or not? And in my, if I walk into Nova Pioneer classroom and I find that hushed rustling, then I realize, we're not in classrooms, and I'm certainly not in classrooms enough. Versus if I walk in and folks are sort of at ease, which happens, I'd say 90% of the time I'm in a Nova Pioneer classroom, it's a culture that supports the sort of continuous learning I mentioned. Sorry, you got me talking about culture, man. I would probably go on too long, but this is like the foundation, and I'm so passionate about it.
There's a lot of depth there, which is what I love. There's a lot of depth. And when you think about the benefits of being in a group, so if I put my investor hat on, it's obvious why there'd be a benefit to investing in 100 schools in a single group rather than obviously one school or two schools. There's diversification. There's an ability to deploy a lot of capital. So if I think just here in our home market of South Africa, you've got Advitech, which is listed, which has over the equivalent of over $1 billion market cap. You've got Cura, which is listed. You've got Stadio, and many private groups of scale as well. It makes it a proper investable institutional asset class. When we think now of the people ultimately who are important, the teachers and the students, etc., is there a benefit to being part of a broader group, or actually are you better off just in a single school?
Yeah. I can say two things about that. First, to your earlier question around like how to keep cost efficient, what's a model? P was one of them. The second was property, and we talked about it earlier, and like making sure you don't have you're not wasteful in your property, both what you build and offer and what it costs. And then the third P is platform. So it's this. You can drive efficiency by having consistency of practice, by centralizing some of your functions, so you don't duplicates. You're not duplicate of a function. So you can drive cost efficiency at a certain. Now there's an initial investment in the platform. Because you have some management costs, for example, or system cost, but at appropriate scale, you start to get real leverage from that. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the investors. There's real investment benefit to the platform as well, from a standpoint of being able to finance and get leverage as you bolt on more volume to your existing platform. So there's and there are relatively few platforms across the continent where investors can say that has or is getting to critical scale, so that additional investments have the leverage, right? And I think there's sort of obviously the two big ones you mentioned, but they're probably a set of us who are sort of in the anywhere from 4,000 to 10, maybe 15,000 students. And they're probably like 4 or 5 of these groups across the continent, which are starting to have like sort of critical mass. But then from a student and family's perspective and teacher perspective, there are absolutely significant benefits, because as a platform you can make investments in experience that an individual school can't make. And you can build systems that create support groups. So, for example, if we think about our innovation leadership programs, or the investments we made in curriculum and learning design, or the investments we made in a post-school success program, it's very hard for an individual school to do that, and much harder to marshal that. But we have invested over our first 10 years, we invested probably over $25 million, $30 million in a platform, some of which has gone into curriculum and learning design that supports better student learning, right? And in teacher practices, that supports more consistent, better practice. We want consistency in practice, and any variance, we want to be an innovation that's upwards, not a breakdown. And so by as a platform, by building that consistency, you can create more consistent, excellent practice, and you can share and develop those programs that we develop, like innovation leadership, like post-school success, like our social emotional learning support programs, and so on. There's also network benefits. Part of our vision for our Nova Year students is connection. We talk about character, capabilities, and connection. Connection is creating social capital, where our students will have very local social capital in the communities and families, maybe, but they won't have the kind of global social capital in Monde that you have now, that you've built by being at Stanford, by being across the world. I'm not. No, you built social capital we've met up in London before Monday. You have global social capital because you've built it. You've invested it through education and through your own efforts and through jobs, and so on. You built it. And similarly, I remember when I worked at McKinsey and one of my first teams. I remember that we had 5 teammates on the project team. All 5 of us were from different offices across the McKinsey global network. Within 3 hours, we were working productively to solve a client's problem. Within 3 hours, because we had a common culture, common approach. I have a vision that Noveneers from across Africa who have a common vision, let's say we want to put up a production, a play, want to produce something, a cultural production, or start a business, are able to connect with like-minded other Noveneers from across the continent because they have a common cultural set, value set, and experience and expectation about the world, but can connect with someone from Kenya, someone from Senegal, someone from Nigeria, because they have a common base as Noveneer alumni. And we've seen that when our students come together from South Johannesburg to Nairobi and connecting and having exchanges, they connect because they share culture principles and they share approaches to learning that they've had common experience with. So there's tremendous social capital we can build, both while in school and as alumni. And so that's a benefit to students. For teachers, much the same. We're able to invest in practices, in programs, our mastery programs, our leadership development programs, our apprenticeship programs. That would be significant investments for individual school. They're significant for us, but they're spread across the cost base of all our platforms. And for parents, obviously beneficiaries of all of that. So yeah, I think platforms well run. And obviously we have our things we need to get a ton better at. So I'm sort of sharing some of our main achievements, but I think platforms well run can drive quality benefits as well as cost efficiencies that enable also investability.
Absolutely, and that enables ultimately a fee point which is lower than the independent schools, which we spoke about partially in this conversation. Fee point, absolutely. So it all feeds back. Yeah, that's wonderful. My final question on Nova Pioneer before I come back to you specifically, Chinezi, sure. Your ambition. You spoke at the beginning about Africa having, I think it's by 2040, the world's largest young population. You're currently over 6,000 students. Where do you want to be? Pick your time frame. What's your ambition? Where do you see Nova Pioneer?
My aspiration for Nova Pioneer is that we're a meaningful part of the African century, the African story. That when you're telling the story of the 21st century Africa, you include Nova Pioneer in that story, right? And Nova Pioneer is a meaningful part of that story. Now, what does that mean? I think there are many ways to impact the story. One of the things that keeps me up is, what's the path from 6,000 to 600,000 or 6 million? I really, as much work, I'm aware of how much work and how hard it's been to walk the journey of getting here. And yet I feel deeply impatient and, to find ways to impact at a much broader scale. Now, there are many ways that could transpire. And one of the conversations we have now is how do we effectively go Nova in the next 10 years? We're 10 years old. How do we think about Nova, the image of a star? How do we build both critical mass in our schools and grow that mass of schools? So if we are 13 schools today, we can be 50 schools, let's say over the next 10 years or whatever that number will be, but also that the programs and whether the teacher development, whether student programs, whether it can amplify and reach many more students beyond our walls, not just through example, but actually through direct service. And so that's my aspiration. Now, there's a ton of work to get there, but for my hope is that we've given how much we've given how much we believe in what we've built and how much potential I think the platform has. My hope is that we will my vision is that we're a meaningful part of the African century and the story that we write over the next decades.
That's fantastic. The thing that I've admired from a distance in your group is the quality of the educational outcomes that you get at the end of this. You've got multiple curricula, you've got the international curricula, you've got local in-country curricula, and I've seen some of the institutions that your students ultimately go to, locally, internationally. They're going to some of the best universities, so it's really been wonderful to watch. And in my mind, that core academic delivery is at the core of everything that comes around it, as well as having 2 founders in yourself and Damani who are doing this for the right reasons and hearts in the right place. So it's wonderful watching your growth from the side, and I hope you reach that vision and that ambition.
Thanks for the encouragement.
Coming down, then this is going to be the final question that I ask, and it's now coming back to you specifically as an individual. Sure. I ask the same question in all of our podcasts, the same concluding question, and that's: please tell us about your favorite teacher or educator.
There's so many, but Paul, the first name that comes to mind is Paul. Paul, and what's interesting is in the high school I attended, we would call our teachers by our first name. Now, that's going to be quite unusual to many of folks in this part of the world where we work.
You didn't have a lot of African parents at that school. I can always carry.
But there was no loss of respect. Paul McNamara was an incredible teacher, and he was my soccer coach. He was also my advisor. He's the reason when I went back to teaching, I called him to say I want to learn a thing or two about what it means to be a teacher and how to teach. But I think he held high expectations, and he was deeply committed to figuring out how to get kids there, whether it was in math class or whether it was on the soccer field. He was the kind of guy who'd wake up at 2 a.m. because he had a good idea for how to run practice the next day, or how to tell the story differently on differential calculus. That was Paul, and and he wasn't the closest friend. He wasn't a buddy. He wasn't soft, but he was. So there was a meaningful distance socially that he kept, but you knew he was 1,000% behind what his role as a teacher for you, and he earned from not just me, but from so many, just a deep following. Filial piety, really. Like Paul was did so much to help young people discover what was possible in them in the classroom, on the field. So Paul is definitely an exemplar teacher. And he made for myself as a young man. My dad was in Nigeria at the time. My mom was in the States. I was off for boarding school. Phil, in many ways, created a second father figure presence in my life that sort of, I think, lifted me, and it was rarely through putting his arm around my shoulder. Occasionally it was that, but it was mostly because I knew he saw something in me, and he challenged me, and he created the practice and structure for me to train in the classroom and beyond the classroom to discover that I was more than I previously knew myself to be. And so, much respect, much love for Paul.
That's extraordinary, Chinezi. Look, if over the course of my lifetime I can have someone talk about me like that, it would be a life well lived.
Yeah, man, I tell you, it's so meaningful.
Thank you so much for the time today, Chinezi. It was wonderful spending time with you, and all the best to you and the team at Nova Pioneer, and we'll be watching your success.
Thank you, Monde. Much appreciated.